Shelly is also staying in the F tier, and right behind him is Shelly. Shelly is staying in the F tier. Also staying in the F tier is Shelly. Also moving down from the C tier, we have Shelly. This is not a joke. This is serious. Shelly is the #1 brawler right now.
In 2017, El Primo was the best brawler in the game. Players couldn't easily defeat him as he had a lot of health and there was no auto-aim button. Why am I bringing this up, you may ask? He needed a counter. And in comes Shelly. She could do a lot of damage close up and had a very good range. Because of this, in August 2017, she received a list of nerfs. Her reload speed was nerfed, and her range was nerfed by an entire tile. And her attack spread was made wider, which made her deal less damage at max range. These nerfs put her in a balanced state because her next change wouldn't come until 4 months later. In December of 2017, Shelly's first star power was added, Shell Shock. This star power didn't help her much and kept her in the same state. The reason why Shelly wasn't in a position to get buffed is because she is a very interesting character. At lower trophies, she was very strong as newer players didn't know how to keep their distance, while at higher trophies she was useless. In March of 2019, the biggest Brawl Stars update arrived, Landscape Mode. Auto-aim also came with this, making Shelly a much stronger brawler as it was much easier to deal maximum damage as long as she was close enough to her enemy. Before this, every character had to manually aim, meaning they had to rely on skill no matter how close they were. 2 weeks after the update, Shelly received her first nerf in half a year. Her damage was reduced by 20, which isn't a huge nerf but made her slightly weaker. After players got used to the feel of the game, people understood that in order to defeat Shelly, all they had to do was stay away from her. This put her in a terrible spot in the meta. 2 months after that nerf, Shelly got some buffs. In late March of 2018, she received a 400 health increase, and a week later she received a range buff. But even these buffs weren't enough to make her a good brawler. During this stage of the game, she had no way of closing the gap between her and her enemies. While most tank brawlers had an ability to catch up to their enemies, she had none of that, and she wasn't a tank. Not having much health and not being able to get close to her enemies meant that she was useless. So even after these buffs, she was considered to be the worst brawler in the game. Despite that she was left untouched for 11 months, Shelly received another buff that increased the slow duration of her star power, but this was obviously not enough to make her stronger. In June 6, 2018, Supercell added her second star power into the game, Band-Aid. This star power turned Shelly into the worst brawler into the very best. Every 20 seconds her bar would fill, and once she fell under a certain amount of health, she would fully heal. She healed 5,000 health from Band-Aid when it first came out. She went from being useless everywhere to being played in every game. She could walk straight towards her enemies because of how tanky she was. And if they did any damage to her, she would just heal up to full HP. You basically had to kill her 2 times. This went on for 2 months until they finally reduced Band-Aid's healing from 5,000 to 2,000. But even that seemed too much as they reduced it again to 1,800. In March 17th of 2020, Shelly had received arguably the worst gadget in the game. Fast forward, this gadget was an attempt to try to make closing the gap easier, but the distance was and still is so short that it hardly makes a difference than just walking up to people. While other brawlers that received dashes had a special ability, hers had nothing special. Around this time was Shelly's lowest point in the meta. She wasn't viable in any 3v3 modes and was only playable on certain solo maps. In September of 2020, Clay Pigeons was added. This gadget was much worse than it is now. At the time, you could only shoot 1 shot. While this helped in some cases, having only 1 shot didn't help her much. 1 day later, she received a round of buffs. Her health was increased by 200. Her supercharge rate was increased, allowing her to cycle her super. However, later in the update, they realized how fast he could get her super and changed it back. This update did almost nothing to help her. Therefore, 3 months later, she received 2 more buffs. Her Shell Shock star power slow duration was increased by 1 second, and her Band-Aid star power charged 5 seconds faster. Supercell didn't want to buff her stats as she would be broken in the lower trophy level. This is why it was so hard to balance her. These buffs didn't make Shelly any stronger, and she was never picked in competitive gameplay. 5 months later, she received 3 more buffs. Her fast-forward gadget range was increased by 1/3 tile. Her Shell Shock Star Power slow duration was increased to 4.5 seconds, and her Band Aid healing went from 1800 to 2000. This still wasn't enough to help her, as 1 month later, her Clay Pigeon's gadget projectile speed was increased by 20% to make it easier to land the shot on her enemies. You would think after all these buffs, she would be back into the meta, right? She wasn't even close to the meta, as she was still the worst brawler in the game. On August 25th of 2021, her Clay Pigeon's gadget received a huge buff. Instead of this gadget only affecting the next shot, it would affect every shot for the next 5 seconds. This was a move in the right direction because this gadget paired with her Shell Shock Star Power was deadly. Even with this though, Shelly was still not a viable pick. In March of 2023, almost 1.5 years later, Shelly received a buff that would forever change her. They increased her movement speed from normal to very fast. Just for you to get a feel of how big this change was, here's a side-by-side of a normal speed and very fast. The difference is very big. After players heard about the news, they expected Shelly to be decent but not good. Update day came around, and Shelly broke the game. Every game mode was filled with Shellys, and not having one on your team made it almost impossible for you to win. Her very fast movement speed allowed her to catch up to her enemies and deal a lot of damage. About a month later, she received a few nerfs. Many people expected her movement speed or damage to get nerfed, but Supercell basically did nothing. They decreased her health from 3800 to 3700 and decreased her Shell Shock Star Power from 4.5 back to 2 seconds. These changes did nothing to Shelly, as she was still the best brawler in the game. To this day, Shelly remains untouched and broken.